The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.
Welcome to the bonus show. We, sometimes I don't want people to think that when I say we made X prediction and it's coming true, that I'm like patting myself on the back. Sometimes it's just like a lot of people are making these predictions because it's so obvious, because Trump is so predictable. We said Mick Mulvaney is going out on a limb. He's going on TV. He's supporting Trump in the most cartoonish and ridiculous fact-free ways. And in the short run, Trump often likes that. He rewards it because he sees it as this kind of unending loyalty. But then there's the blowback where the entire media apparatus says, look at this fool Mick Mulvaney. Look at the stupid things that Mick Mulvaney is saying in defense of Trump. The guy's an idiot. How is Trump still letting him go on TV and talk about what Trump is saying, doing, or thinking? And then the blowback is that Trump ends up getting rid of that person because he realizes that they're making him look bad. And case in point, we now are learning that Donald Trump is not considering Mick Mulvaney's job as interim or acting chief of staff particularly secure. He's reportedly openly talking to people in his circle about getting rid of Mick Mulvaney. And none of this is surprising, Pat. We were not uniquely positioned to predict that this is the way it would go down. It's just this is the way it's gone down with so many Trump staffers.
Yeah, and Mick Mulvaney recently had a horrible press conference. He admitted to Trump crimes. He admitted to the quid pro quo. And then, of course, he went on Fox News Sunday to try to backtrack a little bit, but it wasn't working. And of course, you covered that yesterday, his interview with Chris Wallace. So yeah, Mick Mulvaney not having the best of weeks. Would it be terribly surprising if Trump does decide to can him? But then you wonder, like, was it worth it for Mick Mulvaney to take this job in the first place? Would he have been better off just sitting in Congress, flying under the radar, not being a household name like he's now becoming, and just totally embarrassing himself on the world stage as he's done over the past couple of years working for Trump? Like, you think he would take it all back if he could?
I don't know. I wonder about, like, when you think about, okay, so I think that there's the general understanding that having a prominent position in a presidential administration is generally good for your career, more or less, no matter what happens in your role in the administration. But now we're starting to see that some of the former Trump officials, they're not necessarily doing that well. I mean, Sean Spicer was Trump's early press secretary, and there was the idea that as soon as he leaves, he's going to get all these great offers or whatever. I don't know exactly what Spicer is doing right now. I know that there have been attempts to rehabilitate his image. He showed up on SNL. He's been interviewed in a few places. I don't know that it's been some big coup for Sean Spicer so far. Like, do you know what it is that he's doing now as a job?
Yes, David. Sean Spicer is currently on Dancing with the Stars. That's exactly what he's doing. And
I
he
didn't
wrote a
know
book
that
recently, too, which he's profiting off of handsomely. So, I mean, if Sean Spicer never had taken the job with Trump, he'd probably still right now be working at the RNC, just be like some party insider that no one really knows about. But because he was willing to embarrass himself on the world stage and defend the president endlessly and be ridiculed for so long, that ended up turning out to be a lucrative career move for him, because now he's quite rich and famous. So maybe at the end of the day, for him, it was the right move. Maybe not for Mick Mulvaney, though.
That's a short-term one where he's doing well. I don't know what the long-term prospects are of what Sean Spicer is doing. You've got Sarah Huckabee Sanders, who we talked about Politicon on the regular show today. She's going to be at Politicon from what I see, but it's not totally clear to me exactly what her future is.
Running for governor, maybe?
Could be potentially running for governor, yeah. So anyway, I don't know. I mean, I guess you'd have to ask Mick Mulvaney in a few years, if indeed he gets canned, whether he thinks that his participation in this administration was good or bad. I'm guessing if you ask Michael Flynn, he'd say, no, it wasn't good for me. I don't know. We could probably go through others.
And what a terrible way to run an administration, or like any organization for that matter. Like, instead of bringing this person in who you want to terminate and just telling them face to face that they're no longer working for you, you like talk about it with the insiders at the White House, and then that gets leaked to the media, and then these people find out that they may have to lose their job through like these news stories. Like, that's just totally embarrassing. That's how James Comey lost his job.
Yeah, it's a weird status quo. And in politics, some versions of this, finding out in a weird way that you've lost your job, or very quickly going from the president having full confidence in you to you resigning. Elements of that happen in every administration, but the degree and cartoonish nature of how it's happening in the Trump administration is really something else. Here's something interesting. Russian cosmonauts on the International Space Station have printed meat in space for the first time. There's an Israeli food tech startup called Aleph Farms, which loaded a spacecraft with vials of cow cells, and the cells arrived at the space station. Cosmonauts put them into a 3D printer. The 3D printer produced thin strips of, quote, steak, and we can discuss whether it's real steak or not. And this is one of the first proof of concept incidents that you could essentially print meat even in harsh environments on Earth and elsewhere. And I find this interesting for so many reasons, Pat. One is that there's long been a discussion about if you can print a food at the cellular level, does that make irrelevant the need for example, factory farming if you can do it at scale, and we're nowhere near able to being able to do it at scale. When it comes to animal products, is lab grown or printed meat, is it still considered meat from the point of view of someone who doesn't eat animals? I mean, on the one hand, it was never part of an animal. It was never flesh from an animal, so to speak, to use a vegan term that's often used to describe what we call animal protein. But you did need cow cells in order to create it. So is it meat or not? I don't really know.
I think most vegans and vegetarians don't have an ethical problem with lab-grown meat because you're not actually killing the animal. Maybe you're taking from the animal, but I think you can take the cells without killing them, right? You just have to take some muscle tissue. That's easy enough to do. Maybe they're against it from like a health perspective because vegans and vegetarians typically don't think that it's healthy to eat red meat, and certainly a lot of science and studies back that up. But yeah, like if this is the way of the future and this is the alternative to factory farming, I'm all for that. I don't even know if we have to necessarily go this route because I think that the plant-based alternatives are pretty close in taste, like the Impossible Burger. But of course, I don't think you can send up Impossible Burgers into space. I think if you want to have something that tastes like meat up for the astronauts and in Russia's case, cosmonauts, you got to do something like this instead.
Yeah, I mean, there's also the question of, the nutritional content and the makeup of the Impossible Burger is very, very different than beef, but that's a sort of separate question altogether. One of the things that's always discussed with this is the quote, ick factor of a piece of meat that was not actually, from an animal, and that there's an ick factor associated with that. But the crazy thing about that is a lot of the processed foods that people eat with absolutely no hesitation are basically lab-developed food products that, of course, have origins in things we would identify as food, as ingredients. But is it really that different? If you go and you buy yodels from Drake, the Drake's yodels, which I used to love in high school, I mean, you're basically talking about something where you've taken items that we recognize as food, wheat turned into flour and whatever, but everything is so processed that it's not that different than saying it is a lab-grown thing. I think it's just a question of culture and custom.
I'm going to sound like an obnoxious, pretentious vegan here, but it's interesting how people are averse to eating like these lab-grown meats when they're totally fine with eating like cow secretions and chicken menstruations and parts of the body that you wouldn't necessarily want to put in your mouth. For whatever reason, if it's cooked, they're okay with it. It's kind of weird what we decide is disgusting to us and what we think is acceptable to us. But at any rate, people who have tried this lab-grown product think that it's there's something to be desired, something left to be desired. And maybe they just have to season it better, or maybe they just have to get better with the process. But ultimately, I think different methods like this are the way of the future because factory farming is not sustainable.
No.
Certainly, it's going to maybe hurt the meat industry's profits in the short term, but they could probably adjust and maybe patent some of the processes that make lab-grown meat so they can continue to make money. Not so good for the dairy farmers, though, I think, long term.
Yeah, I mean, listen, I go around the world looking for the best cow secretions and secretions of all kinds. So I don't know that I'm a fan of that, but to each their own, of course. Okay, we're only 5 months until the 2020 census is supposed to be fully underway, and we've been following the disaster that has been the census. And every time we talk about this, Pat, I get this feeling of dread because so much has already gone wrong with regard to the 2020 census that it's hard to even sum it up to get us all on the same page. I mean, I guess to sum it up in the most concise way, we have seen everything from Trump not staffing the census properly, to Trump not funding the census properly, to Trump trying to manipulate the census to serve political gains, like political goals, like, for example, by including a question about citizenship. We could get into the details, but those are like the overarching stories with the census. Now, the census is experiencing a new issue, which is that the Census Bureau needs to train and hire, or I guess hire and then train, close to 500,000 temporary workers to do the work, to knock on doors, to interview people in households that haven't filled out the form themselves. If you didn't know, if you don't fill out the census form, someone will eventually or is supposed to come to your house to get the information about your household. They are extraordinarily behind on this and underfunded, and there seems to be very little political desire from the current administration to actually make this happen. I don't know if it's 4 years or 5 years or 6 years that I've been talking about this, but I've been saying we are on track for a bad 2020 census. When Trump was elected, we were on even worse track for a 2020 census. It is looking really, really bad.
Yeah, it goes totally overlooked, and Republicans played the 2010 census well, so it's important that Democrats at least try to play the 2020 census well, because that determines redistricting and who gets to draw the districts in each state. All very important. And I'd imagine, too, that like 10 years ago for the 2010 census, they didn't have the staffing issues that we're having today because we were in a bad economy at the time. The unemployment rate was high, so people were just looking for temporary work. And these jobs that last, a few months, maybe they pay well enough to pay the bills, and people were willing to take the job because they didn't have anything else that they were waiting on. They didn't have any other source of employment. Whereas now the unemployment rate is low. And maybe some people need a side gig or whatever. But if you want to make this like your only job, then it's only going to be your job for like a few months, and then you're out of work and you have to find something again.
Yeah, I mean, the risk of when we are close to full employment, as measured in one sense, the risk of taking a temporary job like the census and then counting on going back and getting a proper long-term job is a bigger risk, because when unemployment is low, there are fewer of those jobs available from a mathematical perspective. So there's a whole bunch of factors coming together. And of course, what we've learned is when participation in democratic processes is down, it's good for the American right. So the Republicans benefit from the census being carried out not fully. Republicans benefit from voter turnout being lower. There's probably other examples I'm not thinking of. Republicans benefit from fewer people getting college degrees, right? I mean, I'm kind of thinking out loud here, but we know that the more educated you are, the less likely you are to support Republicans, all else being equal. So it's unfortunate when you're fighting people who benefit merely by keeping people out of the processes that we have, and that's a really difficult thing to fight.
And that's exactly what Trump tried to do with the citizenship question. If you put a citizenship question in the census and people are, maybe worried about their citizenship status, maybe they're undocumented immigrants, they're not going to fill out the census, and then you'd have an inaccurate representation of what these communities actually look like, and that leads to bad distribution of resources to fund education programs and healthcare programs, and just political representation overall. That's exactly what they try to do. They try to disenfranchise because they know they can't win over the hearts and minds of voters.
Yep, and one of the things that's difficult about the status quo of American politics and the two-party duopoly is that the left, by and large, succeeds by doing things. And you have to fight people to get things done because there's inertia. There is, to take something that is stagnant and to put it in motion, especially when it's a big thing, takes a lot of energy and political will and financing or whatever the case may be. Republicans can win just by preventing things from happening, because when your approach is we want government doing as little as possible, we want to conserve rather than progress, to think about conservatism versus progressivism, they can win merely by gumming up the system enough that it just doesn't work and nothing happens. They talk about let's just eliminate departments, for example, or not fund them, or not fund projects. And that's unfortunately a really tough financial, political reality to fight against, because when one side wins by doing and the other side wins merely by blocking, it's much easier to block than it is to do when you're talking about an apparatus as large as the federal government or as large as state governments. And that's just a reality that the left has to fight against, and we've been fighting against it for a very long time. That does it for today's bonus show. We will have a new show and bonus show tomorrow and the next day, a full week of programming. Thanks to all of our new members and new patrons who are joining us today.
The David Pakman Show at davidpakman.com.